I was going to say it's a pleasure to be here. No, it actually is a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, oh, it's on there, but not on there? Well, I'll just tell him while he's getting this set up. You know, I've been called many things in my life, but being called Donald Trump is the biggest insult of all, particularly at this time. And then when he came down, he says, I could have been harsher, and I don't know what is harsher than being compared to Donald Trump these days. Okay, and then just get rid of this part on the right? Okay, beautiful. Yeah, gotcha. So, listen, there was a lot said in that first 45 minutes. In terms of the presentation of anything in anatomy, it just wasn't accurate. That's all I can say. We can talk about in the panel, et cetera. But here's what I want to do in the next 45 minutes. Learning about this initiative that by the government for, quote, medication-free wards, I understand it was as an alternative really to forced treatment and that sort of thing, which is, of course, becomes a rationale for why you want to offer people choice. I think there's another rationale for this, and maybe medication-free ward is the wrong word here. The question really is, at this time of 2017, does medication, is there evidence showing that it improves even short-term outcomes? But more to the point, how does it affect people's lives over the longer term? Because, of course, initial use often so much leads to use at 5, 10, and 15 years. And so you want to see what history and science can tell us about that very important question about how medications affect people's lives over the long term. And we're going to be talking about antipsychotics. And the reason I wanted to focus, of course, on antipsychotics is when you look at forced treatment, it's usually with antipsychotics. And the other reason is this. If we look at the narrative that drives societal care today, it really forms around antipsychotics more than any other class of drugs. And the conventional narrative goes like this, that prior to the arrival of antipsychotics, people with psychotic disorders were confined to mental hospitals. They didn't get out. And that it was the arrival of antipsychotics that made it possible to start emptying the hospitals and to discharge patients. And the other part of that conventional narrative is that antipsychotics are absolutely essential. At least that's the narrative in the United States, both for short-term and long-term. And really part of the conventional narrative, and you really heard that in the sort of the mocking of me in the beginning, is that anybody who doubts that truth is a flat earther, non-scientific, that sort of thing. And that's the way that people who challenge that conventional narrative are basically dismissed and treated. Now, I want to notice one point. Did you see any evidence point presented in the first 45 minutes that showed antipsychotics improve long-term outcomes? Did you even see evidence that it shows that they really are effective over the short term? Okay, it wasn't an evidence-based presentation. So what I'd like to do here is go over the evidence base that surrounds this question, okay? And here's the questions we want to look at. First of all, we want to, in that conventional narrative, what were the hospital discharge rates, and I have some Norwegian data, in the decade prior to the arrival of the first antipsychotics. So the antipsychotic chlorpromazine is introduced into medicine in 1955, and this is the start of the psychopharmacological era. And in the conventional narrative, this is seen as kicking off a great psychopharmacological revolution, a great advance in care. So we want to see, is that true? Did people prior to the arrival of antipsychotics not get out, first episode psychotic patients? And did the arrival increase the discharge rates? Because if the conventional narrative is true, that's what we should see. Okay? And that's the second part. Did these discharge rates notably improve after the arrival of this drug? Which really, and we're talking about first episode patients, so we want to see if the use of these medications were effective in essence over the short term. You see point number 3? this goes to the question, is here we are in 2017, okay? Is there evidence, in fact, that when you use these drugs with first episode psychotics patients, that it improves outcomes at 1 year? Do we have that evidence in the evidence base after 55 years? Now, most people would say it must be there, but we'll look to see if it is indeed there. And then finally, the most important thing is I'm going to go over studies, a number of studies that have been done that have reported on outcomes for non-compliant patients or unmedicated patients versus those who are compliant and medicated patients on a number of domains, okay? And we're just going to present the evidence. And before I even get into one thing on this, no one is arguing for no treatment. No one is saying let people have psychotic and not have some form of care. So the whole question is what form of care, especially once you start in that first moment, say you have a psychotic episode and enter the system, what sort of care helps put you on the best long-term course? So remember that idea, okay? So in 1956, the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, which is our agency for researching psychiatric disorders, okay? It's our premier agency. They convened a meeting and they said, how are we going to know if these new drugs are effective? And they said, well, we have to figure out what are the outcomes we are getting today, and then we can see what are the outcomes we're going to start getting in the future. But we need to know what outcomes we're getting today before we can see if this new therapy improves on those outcomes, okay? So just so you know, I didn't cherry pick this data. This was the data presented at that 1956 meeting, and you'll see something surprising. What you find from 1945 to 1955, if you study first episode people diagnosed with schizophrenia at that time, you'll see that 65% would be discharged within 12 to 18 months. You see that in these two studies. And then even more important is what percentage of the patients were living independently outside of the hospital in these first episode cohorts at the end of 3 and 5 years. And you'll see one is 73%, one is 70%. This is before the drug era. Now what happens even in this data, if you have 100 patients come in, say in 1948, 65 are discharged, what are you left with? You're left with 35 who did not get out, and that becomes part of your chronic population. But you're forgetting about the capacity, so to speak, to recover over time that you saw in these hospital settings. So just my point here is the conventional narrative that remembers that people didn't get well at all before the introduction of antipsychotics is not borne in the data. Now here's your Norwegian data. So this was a study of, I think, all the hospitals. They gathered all the data in the hospitals for patients who were treated in this 4 years for functional psychoses. And then they looked at the status of the patients at the end of December 31st, 1953. Okay, and what do you find? You find that a small percentage died in the hospital, transferred to other cares like to other facilities, still in the hospital, but look at this. So you do have a group that is discharged, and then they get readmitted, they have a relapse. What do you see here? These people were discharged and never came back to the hospital, and you did not have a disability system or a social service system that was providing sort of, financial support. So what you see in your own data for that time is, in fact, people prior to having the antipsychotics, a significant percentage recovering and staying out of the hospital, okay? So now the next question is, chlorpromazine, I think you called it Largactil, right here in Norway, I'm not sure, but the first antipsychotic is chlorpromazine, and we had one study done in the United States at that time to see if this was now going to improve discharge rates. It was done by the state of California. They looked at all their first episode patients in 1956, and then they looked at the end of 18 months, what were the discharge rates. And this was where some hospitals weren't using the drugs left so much or at all, and others that had really adopted it. And what they found was that the discharge rate for those not treated with antipsychotics, this is first episode schizophrenia patients, was 88% in 18 months. It was actually a little higher than it was for those treated with antipsychotics. So what did the researchers conclude? Just read it. Can you all read this? Is it big enough? I want you to read the researchers' words and not my words, okay? Because apparently I'm not a very good with the truth if I'm Donald Trump. But you can see what they say is the untreated patients, untreated, consistently show a somewhat lower retention rate. Now here's your data from Norway. Here was the comparison made of this very question by Norwegian researchers. So they looked and they said, okay, well, here's all the people that were admitted. These are big numbers too. You see the numbers of functional psychosis. I think this is from all your Norwegian hospitals that in the entire country. So what do you see? Discharged and not readmitted, and it's the same time thing. So you have 4 years, and then they're looking at the end of the 5th year. They're basically the same, right? There's no big difference. So in other words, we're not seeing an improvement in first episode patients in terms of discharge from the hospital being better. How about by individual diagnosis? Here's before the introduction of chlorpromazine, and here's the after. What do you see? You see a great improvement in discharge rates? There's two messages here. One, are we really seeing an improvement? But the other is, remember that many people with time that have a psychotic episode and treatment of some sort get better, okay? Now, this is the most, I was asked, do I believe that antipsychotics have been shown to be effective over the short term? Now, in Anatomy of an Epidemic, I said, yeah, that's the data, okay? I didn't really want to take this question on. But the Cochrane Collaboration, do you all know about the Cochrane Collaboration? It's an international group of researchers that is supposed to review the research literature and say, what does it say to us? Now, if you look at studies on short-term efficacy, there are a lot of studies, hundreds, but here's how they're designed. And this is how every study of the new atypical antipsychotics was designed. You take people who are on drugs, okay? Then you yank them all off the drug. You randomize half to placebo. You randomize the other half back on drug. And then you see who has a greater remission of psychotic symptoms at the end of 6 weeks. Now, one reason you yank them off is because you want psychotic symptoms to increase, okay? And that way you need them actively psychotic to see if the drugs are going to work. And that becomes the rationale, the design for short-term efficacy. So what's the problem with that design? The problem is the placebo group is not a placebo group. It's a drug withdrawal group. And we actually all know that coming off drugs abruptly is a really bad idea. And by the way, some of the suicide data of people released from hospitals that stopped taking drugs, that is attributed to being off med, they're going through withdrawal. So what the Cochrane Collaboration did, they canvassed the literature that is around for 50 years, and they said, how about studies in medication-naive people where it compares drug to some other form, either placebo, psychosocial care, milieu therapy. You know how many studies they could find? 5. In 50-some years, to see if people had a better outcome at 1 year with initial exposure to antipsychotics. 5. Only with a total of 900 patients. And what did they conclude? Read it. So, this is not me. What they are saying, the Cochrane Collaboration, this international group of researchers saying it is 2000, I think there's 11, we don't have evidence that in fact these drugs in a medication-naive group improve outcomes at 1 year. We do not have that evidence. Next. So now really I'm going to start getting just into the long-term outcome data in the time I have. One of the one main retrospective study we have that was funded by the NIMH was done by a man named Samuel Bachhoven. And he had been at Boston Psychopathic Hospital in 1947 when people were treated with a lot of psychosocial care, but we didn't have the drugs yet, and he had 5-year outcomes for that. And then he matched it to a cohort of first episode patients treated in 1967 with drugs and also psychosocial care. And here's what he found when he did this retrospective study. There was a little greater relapse rate in the modern era, in other words, more rehospitalization. But the most important thing he found was that the 67 cohort was much less socially dependent, much more socially dependent. Their functional outcomes were not nearly as good. So in 1947, 76% were successfully living in the community at the end of 5 years. Here they were much more on welfare, et cetera. So what does 𝗀𝗵𝗂𝗶𝗱, I hope you all have your reading glasses, okay? What does he say? And focus on rather unexpectedly. He's not expecting this outcome. Their extended use in aftercare may prolong the social dependency of many discharged patients. That's a retrospective study, okay? Now we want to see other studies in the modern era, and I'm going to try to find basically every study I can that compares longer-term outcomes for medicated and unmedicated patients, okay? And the unmedicated patients in generally are going to be people who took themselves off, not in every case. Now, this is one of the 5 studies that was identified by the Cochrane Collaboration as providing a comparison for medication-naive people, first episode people who were either treated conventionally or without drug. So the way the study was designed, people came into the hospital, first episode, and they either were put on antipsychotic or they were just not put on antipsychotic, okay? Then they're discharged, and he follows them for 3 years. And here's what this means. You see where it says, and it's randomized, okay? This is a randomized study. So people get randomized either to treatment or no drug treatment. No meds means no meds during the hospital care. Off means they stayed off medication in the 3 years after discharge. Antipsychotic off meant antipsychotic in the hospital, and then they went off on their own when they were discharged. No meds means they were, again, no meds in the hospital, and then in the after period they went on the drugs. And so that's the 2 parts, okay? So what do you see in this data? What group had the best outcomes? It was the group, roughly 2/3, who weren't exposed to antipsychotics in the hospital and stayed off afterwards. So that's about 67%. What do we see in terms of recovery rates before the introduction of antipsychotics? About 60%, right? 65%. So you're seeing, I think, here a natural recovery rate. All right? And so basically 2/3 are getting better. Which group has the worst outcome? Which has the highest rehospitalization rate? Antipsychotics on. Okay, just one study. And this was confounded by a higher dropout rate initially in the group in no meds. So there is that confounding factor. What does he conclude, though, about his own study? And again, please read. This is one of the only 5 studies done that compares in medication-naive longer-term outcomes. And he says the key here is, if we're interested in long-term improvement, long-term, that may be different than short-term, okay? But that's one of the 5 studies. Next, this was a very famous study. You heard about it a little bit in the beginning. This was a study designed by 𝗺𝗺𝗵𝗆. 𝗺𝗺𝗵𝗆 was the head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH at this time. So he's our top schizophrenia doctor. It was a randomized study. So people come into the hospital. Some of them arrive with handcuffs and all. And then they're going to be randomized either to treatment as usual in the hospital with drugs, or they're going to be randomized to a house, which is staffed by ordinary people, non-professionals actually. Now, it's not a no-med protocol. Here was the protocol. They would try not to put people on, they would not put people on antipsychotics right away in the Soteria house. They would use benzodiazepines if people couldn't sleep, okay? And then if people weren't getting better after a week or 2 or deteriorating, then they would initiate antipsychotic use. So it was meant to be a selective use model for the medications, all right? Project ran 12 years. This is N is the number of people treated at the Soteria project. By the way, a small aside fact. The man who really ran the project was Voice Hendricks, Jimi Hendrix's cousin. And if you want to see why staffing can be so important, you should invite Jimmy and Boyce Hendricks here sometime, and you'll be charmed by this person. He has a warmth that is extraordinary. So here's the results. At 6 weeks, Soteria Project was just as effective form of care as drug care in a hospital in terms of reducing psychotic symptoms. That's the first one. At the end of 2 years, as a whole, this approach produced better outcomes. They had lower psychopathology scores, fewer readmissions, and better global adjustment. And here is the antipsychotic use. Because they delayed initial use, about 40% never needed to go on. Think of it as an escape valve. And then there was another 40% that did need the medication temporarily for a period of time. And then it seemed like there was 20% of people that really did benefit from, needed it continuously. So it really is talking about a selective use model, and here's the key. With first episode, if you can have a form of care that allows this group that doesn't, can get better without medications, if you can let that to happen, you can improve your overall outcomes. What does Lauren Mosher say? What does our top schizophrenia doctor say? So you can read it. I don't know if he was an early Donald Trump or what, but you can read it. It's his own conclusion. And he says we need to re-examine this. Real quickly, then we have cross-cultural studies. These were studies done by the World Health Organization in the 1970s and 1980s. These studies were done like this. They compared outcomes in 3, quote, developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the US and other rich countries. There was at least one Scandinavian country that had a site in this. Diagnosis is being made by Western doctors. And here's what happened. After the first study, which I think was the 5-year studies, they noted that the patients in the poor countries had much better outcomes, a considerably better course. And then they conclude that being in a developed country was a strong predictor of not attaining a complete remission in a rich country. Okay? And that in the poor countries, they had an exceptionally good outcome. And now after that first study, here's what the WHO, World Health Organization investigators hypothesized. Maybe the outcomes are better in the poor countries because they're more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics regularly. Valid hypothesis, right? If drugs are to be so essential, then compliance should be associated with better outcomes. So they measured medication usage in the second study, and what did they find? They found that in the poor countries, they were using the drugs differently. They were using them acutely but not chronically. So only 16% of patients were kept on the drugs long term, whereas, of course, that's the standard of care in the rich countries. Now, they go back at 15 to 20 years, and they look up this cohort of patients. And what do they find? The outcome differential holds up general clinical state, symptomatology, disability, and social functioning. And look at this. Remember these data as we go forward. 53% were never psychotic anymore, they're off, and 73% were employed. I'm not going to present this data. There's a new international study funded by Eli Lilly. I think it's 11,000 patients in 37 countries. The point of this study is everybody has to be on medication for 3 years, cross-cultural, and now the outcomes in the poor countries, developing countries, are no longer better than in the rich countries. In fact, they're now a little worse. But it's not that the outcomes in the rich countries have come up, it's that the outcomes in the poor countries, as they've adopted this new model, have come down. This is the best long-term study we have done in the United States. It was done by a psychologist at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, the University of Medicine, and a psychiatrist named Tom Job. His name is Martin Harrow. Here's how the study was designed. He enrolls 200 patients with psychotic diagnoses from 2 area hospitals, one private, one public. That way he gets a diverse group. And everybody will be treated conventionally in the hospital with drugs. They're discharged, and now he's just going to follow them at 2 years, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 years, and look how they're doing. Now, one of the hypotheses was that those who stop taking their medication will be doing terribly. They're going to be homeless. He's going to see that this shows, in fact, it confirms why you need to be on your drugs. At the end of 15 years, he still had 145 of his 200 patients in the study. That is a really low dropout rate for a schizophrenia study in the United States. And you'll see he has 64 schizophrenia patients diagnosed by DSM-3, 81 with milder psychotic disorders. Fortunately, this is a young group. Most are either first or second hospitalization, so he's following them early in the course of the illness. Now, there's data at 20 years, some at 15 years, etc. So, this is in the 64 schizophrenia patients. At the end of 2 years, roughly 25 of the 64 schizophrenia patients had stopped taking their medications against doctor's orders, okay? They basically had left care. And you'll see, they're anxious. They're actually a little bit more anxious than the group on antipsychotics. But what happens between year 2 and 4.5? Do you see what happens? There's a lot of healing going on, recovery going on in the off antipsychotic group. Their anxiety is abating, whereas it's not in the on group. This is the only place in the literature I know of you really see a time course of healing in basically between 2.5 to 5 years. It gives you a different perspective. How about cognitive function? It's better at every follow-up for the off-med group. This is the psychotic symptoms. So at 10 years, he looks at the people who are at least off antipsychotics at that time versus those who are on. What do you see here? First of all, a lot of people off are not psychotic. But does this show drugs that are working on the psychotic symptoms? The majority are still psychotic, taking the meds. How about recovery rates? Recovery rates, he defined you had to be asymptomatic when you came. You couldn't have been in the hospital in the previous year at this moment. And you had to have, you had to either be working or in school at least 50% of the time and have relatively good social functioning. You see again at 2 years, there's not much difference. The divergence happens between year 2 and 4.5. And by year 4.5, the recovery rate is 8 times higher for those off medication. And what Harold found was this. The people who recovered off medication disappeared. The psychiatrist didn't see them. And actually society didn't see them because they got off. He had someone become a lawyer, someone became a professor. Once they recovered, they didn't go around saying, hey, you know what, I used to have schizophrenia. So we don't see this, is what he's saying. Now this is a slide that I did put together from his data because he ends up with 4 groups. And he just talks about, he has a scale called global adjustment. He has schizophrenia on and off, and he has other milder disorders on and off. So the group with milder disorders had a better prognosis at baseline, okay? They weren't as ill, and they should have an expected better outcome. So how did the outcomes match up? Well, the worst was schizophrenia on meds. The next worst was milder disorders on meds. So milder disorders on meds ended up worse than schizophrenia off meds. Now that belies an easy explanation that it was just a difference in initial severity of symptoms because that goes counter to what you would expect. Okay? Again, you read what the researcher concluded by his own long-term study. Not my conclusion. Okay? He said this in 2008. Now, he has subsequently done a really interesting thing. He's looked at, he went into his schizophrenia patients, and then he looked at people who were off by year 2 and stayed off the whole time, and then he looked at patients who were medication compliant during the whole time. And what did he see with psychotic symptoms? Which group do you see the abatement in? Which group is doing much less psychotic over time? It's the group that got off by year 2 and never went back on the meds. But you also see, again, the people on meds, the compliant people, have a lot of psychotic symptoms. This is the work history, same thing in these 2 groups. Those who were either on meds all the time or off meds, you'll see that the group off meds, the employment rates are quite high, not so high with those off meds. I point this out because really what he found was this. You needed to get off the meds pretty early on to have this good outcome. That's what he really found. So here's what our leading researcher in the United States, funded by the NIMH, concluded after his long-term study. Okay? Next. The complaint about Harold was that it wasn't randomized. We have a sort of randomized study done out of the Netherlands. Here was the design. You get first episode patients who are stable for 6 months on antipsychotics. And now they're randomized either to a dose reduction discontinuation arm or treatment as usual. So the randomization is this. It's a randomization of a moment in time to a different treatment protocol. But once that happens, as he follows them for the next 7 years, it's going to, people be free to go off medication or on, regardless of what group they're in. But how does that treatment decision play out? Now, if you stop this study here, what do you see? You see that there's a higher relapse rate in the drug-withdrawn group or the drug-tapered group, okay? You stop it here, you say this is a bad idea because there's higher relapse rates. But in this study, the relapses weren't so severe. They managed them, and now they looked at relapse rates at 7 years. Not much difference. How about recovery rates? The group randomized to drug discontinuation or tapering had 40% recovery rate versus 18%. So at least in this study, that moment of treatment where you tried to introduce tapering led to a doubling of the recovery rate. And now you also see that some of the people randomized to drug discontinuation or tapering, and they either got down to a low dose or off. Some in that group actually went back on conventional medications, and some in the other group randomized to treatment as usual, took themselves off. So this is just the 7-year results based on medication use. And you see the group that got down to low dose or off, greater symptom remission, greater functional remission, and greater 3 times the full recovery rate. Here's what he says. By the way, how much time do I have? I need to know whether I should. You're going to have to read fast. Okay, you see how much?
You have 32 minutes.
Left, or I've taken 32. Uh-oh, I better go. Okay, you'll see here he's saying he's worried that antipsychotics may worsen functional outcomes, okay? And then next, he's saying we've been looking at the wrong thing. We've just been measuring symptoms over the short term. We need to look at how people are living over longer periods of time. All right, that's his conclusion. Functional gains only appeared in long-term monitoring. This is a study out of Denmark. It was a study where they looked at 496 first-episode schizophrenia patients diagnosed between these years. Early on in the course, at time of recruitment, been on antipsychotics less than 12 weeks. At 10 years, there's still 303 patients in the study. There were 121 who were non-compliant. They weren't following their doctor's orders, stopped taking antipsychotics. So he gets 2 groups at 10 years, those who are non-compliant and the compliant patients. And he says, at baseline, there was no difference between these 2 groups, severity of illness, etc. Okay, here's the outcomes. Blue is non-compliant, the red is compliant. Which group has a greater remission rate? Non-compliant. Which group is more likely to be employed? Non-compliant. Anyway, that was the Danish OPUS study. This is another study. It's called the Finnish birth cohort study. And the way this study works is they had been following people born in 1966 in northern Finland, I think across a lot of health outcomes. But they had 70 people in that cohort who were diagnosed with schizophrenia spectrum disorders, okay? And now they're just going to look at how is that cohort doing in the year 2000. And they're 34 years old. You see medium illness. Of the 70, 46 were taking antipsychotics in 2000, 24 who were off. And then the group is then followed for another 8.7 years. What's the outcome? Which group is doing better? Which group in this cohort study is more likely to be in remission, employed, have a social factor, and which group is more likely to be on disability? You see, it's the non-compliant group, once again, that had better outcomes. And this is just the rehospitalization rates during the 9-year follow-up. There's not I would say there's not a great deal of difference there. So when we started this, and I was trying to do a very quick review of a long evidence-based history, do we see, prior to the introduction of antipsychotics, what do we see? We see that more than 60% of patients were discharged. And we would see at longer-term follow-ups about at least 2/3 or more would be living independently in the community. And what that does for the debate you're having in Norway, it provides a possibility that needs to be part of the debate around medication-free wards, if that's what you want to, if that's the term. Because really, I think you're talking about rethinking antipsychotics and rethinking whether you really should be forcing people on these drugs, particularly and then over long term. So we need to know that many people got better naturally, okay, in the absence of antipsychotics. you'll see that we do not find in the discharge rates that they notably improve after the introduction of the drug. You'll see we still do not have compelling evidence that the drug improve outcomes at the end of 1 year in real studies. And then finally, on long-term outcome studies that look at how people are functioning, time and time again, what you find is the non-compliant patients are functioning better, they're more likely to be employed, they're less likely to be on disability, and actually they're less likely to be symptomatic. And what that data tells you, imagine we had a system of care that helped people become medication-free. In other words, maximize the possibility that they could be in this drug-free good outcome group. Now, I don't believe everybody will end up in that group. I don't believe that. But I believe you need to have a system of care that maximizes the possibility for the individual to end up with that life. And think about the 20-year-old that has a psychotic break. What do you want to do for that 20-year-old? What do you want to do as a society? Do you want to turn him into a lifelong patient that has to take antipsychotics for the rest of his life? Or do you want to give that person the best chance possible to have had a time of psychosis, a time of an episode, and get a full life back that involves functioning well, employment, that sort of thing, and not suffering the adverse effects of the drugs? That's what we're talking about here, is if you rethink this around some sort of selective model, you try to remember is, what is the possibility for getting this type of recovery? And what the evidence base is telling us is there's a lot of possibility. And in fact, our modern view that these disorders, these psychotic disorders, run a chronic course naturally is not true. They run a chronic course today pretty much, but that's a chronic course in medicated patients. So again, I know I was seen as just an idiot in the first presentation. It's not me. Who is this guy? Peter Tyrer, editor, British Journal of Psychiatry. This is not, and what is he? I'm going to read this part. It is time to reappraise the assumption that antipsychotics must always be the first line of treatment for people with psychosis. Favorite part of this. This is not a wild cry from the distant outback, that's me, but a considered opinion of influential researchers. There is an increasing body of evidence that the adverse effects of antipsychotic treatment are, to put it simply, not worth the candle. Now, I also run a website called Mad in America, where we publicize this research and we publicize the voices of people with lived experience. We recently posted a letter an essay written by Sir Robin Murray of the UK. He is the most prominent psychiatrist related to schizophrenia in the whole country. And what he says is, the title is The Mistakes I Made. And among the many mistakes he talks about, he basically says the counter-narrative that is in Anatomy of an Epidemic, we should be paying attention to it. And you heard in the first talk about how, is there any possibility that drugs increase the vulnerability to psychosis? Well, Sir Robin Murray in this post goes, we began to worry about this in 1978. And he's right, that's when they did. And the biology of this was this. The antipsychotics block dopamine receptors. In response to that blockade, the brain increases the number of its receptors. It's now said to be super sensitive to dopamine. And our lead researcher, one of our lead researchers in 1978 says this, William Carpenter. We know that once you're on drugs, if you come off, you're at greater risk of relapse. But we raised the possibility, but then he says, but what if people had never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raised the possibility that antipsychotics over the long term make people more biologically vulnerable to psychosis than they would be in the normal course of their illness. Now that's what I was talking about in Anatomy of an Epidemic. You have Martin Harrell using that very biological explanation to explain his data. You have the head from the National Institute of Mental Health recently saying, Tom Insel, we have to ask ourselves whether these drugs are worsening long-term outcomes, not me. And Sir Robin Murray, when he talks about the mistakes that were made, he says we ignored this worry about dopamine supersensitivity. Now in 2010, when my book was published, I was called a heretic. And there were some really nasty reviews. There really were. My favorite was where I was compared to an AIDS denier. And I was compared to not just an AIDS denier, but a South African dictator who, by virtue of denying AIDS, was causing thousands of people to die. And if you read this book, that's the danger of this book. What I see has happened in the past 6 years, as more data come on, as I've moved from a heretic to hopefully being forgotten, as psychiatrists themselves, the leaders, start investigating these outcome studies and start thinking about how do we use these medications differently to improve long-term outcomes. So you in Norway have opened the door to a different thinking, and all I can say I understand the forced treatment rationale behind it. But as you think of what to do as a country, think as if, rather than even just medication-free wards, can you think about how can you use these medications over the long term to get some of these better outcomes we see in these studies? Okay, thank you.